Tonight, we're going to explore these lost worlds together, wandering through time to understand how mighty civilizations can vanish beneath the shifting sands, and what their disappearance teaches us about the delicate dance between human ambition and nature's relentless power. This isn't merely the stuff of fantasy novels or Hollywood adventure films. Throughout history, the desert has indeed swallowed kingdoms whole, leaving behind only whispered legends and the occasional artifact that surfaces after a particularly strong sandstorm. If you're enjoying this journey through these lost worlds tonight, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you listening from? Are you perhaps in a desert region yourself, where the reality of water scarcity is a daily concern, or somewhere where green fields stretch to the horizon and rivers flow year-round? For a moment, close your eyes and picture yourself at the edge of the Sahara Desert as the sun goes down. The endless dunes in front of you look like a golden ocean that has been frozen in time. The winds that have blown for thousands of years have shaped each ridge and valley. The air smells faintly of rain that may never come, and the silence is so deep that it feels heavy. Now picture that under your feet, buried under tons of sand, are the remains of whole civilizations. There are palaces with beautiful mosaics where nobles used to hold court, busy markets where merchants used to haggle in a dozen languages, libraries full of ancient wisdom written on papyrus and parchment, and temples where prayers used to echo through marble halls decorated with gold and precious stones. At first glance, the idea seems almost impossible. How can a whole kingdom just go away? We're not talking about a small village or a remote trading post. We're talking about huge cities with hundreds of thousands of people, complicated irrigation systems that rival modern engineering, huge monuments that took generations to build, and well-organized governments with huge bureaucracies, standing armies, and diplomatic ties that reach across continents. But the archaeological record shows that this has happened many times in human history, especially in places where the desert meets what used to be fertile land. To understand how this happens, we first need to know what deserts are like. Deserts are not like huge geological museums where time stands still. They're living, changing systems that grow and shrink like breathing organisms. They react to changes in the weather, ocean currents, and the way the atmosphere works over timescales that are much longer than human memory. The Sahara Desert, for example, has grown and shrunk a lot over the last few thousand years. Its edges move like a slow tide across the African continent. In the past, what is now a barren wasteland was a green savanna with lakes and rivers, where hippos waded and crocodiles basked on muddy banks. Archaeological evidence indicates that approximately 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was inhabited not only by large animals, but also by flourishing human settlements engaged in millet and sorghum cultivation, cattle herding, and the creation of some of Africa's earliest rock art. The paintings they left on the cliffs show a world full of life: giraffes reaching for acacia leaves, herders taking care of cows next to streams, and hunters chasing antelope across grasslands that went on forever. But the weather on our planet is always changing. The rains that had kept this green Sahara alive started to fail as the weather patterns around the world changed because of the Earth's orbit around the sun. The monsoons that had brought life-giving water from the Atlantic slowly lost strength and moved south. During the hot season, rivers that had been flowing for thousands of years started to dry up and then stopped flowing completely. Lakes that had been home to fishing communities for generations slowly shrank until they became salt pans that sparkled like mirrors in the sun. Then they disappeared completely, leaving only white scars on the land where water had once reflected clouds. The change didn't happen all at once. It took hundreds and thousands of years, which gave some civilizations time to change their farming, come up with new technologies, or move to areas that were more welcoming. But some people, because of cultural traditions, religious beliefs, or just not being able to organize such big moves, held on to their lands until the desert took them all. These were often the most advanced societies, the ones that put the most money into building permanent structures, and had the most faith in there to solve environmental problems. Think about the interesting and sad story of the Garamantes, a civilization that thrived in what is now Libya's Fezzan Basin from about 500 BCE to 700 CE. The Garamantes built a great kingdom in the middle of what would become one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. In this area, temperatures during the day often go over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and rainfall is measured in fractions of an inch per decade instead of inches per year. Garama, their capital, was a busy city that would have amazed anyone from the classical world. The city was made up of multi-story buildings made of local stone and decorated with intricate geometric patterns. It was home to tens of thousands of people and covered several square kilometers. The streets were laid out in a neat grid, with wide boulevards for ceremonial processions and narrow alleyways that offered shade from the harsh midday sun. There were workshops where skilled craftsmen made weapons and tools out of iron, beautiful pottery and jewellery out of precious metals that were traded all over the world. The Garamantian civilization was especially impressive because they were very good at hydraulic engineering and managing water in a very dry area. They came up with a clever way to use fossil water aquifers deep below the desert floor by building underground channels called fagaras. These weren't just wells, they were complicated networks of carefully graded tunnels that could move water over long distances using only gravity. Building these fagaras took a lot of skill and bravery. Sometimes workers had to dig shafts more than 60 meters deep into solid rock, and then dig horizontal tunnels that had to have a very specific slope, steep enough to let water flow, but not so steep that erosion would destroy the channels. The work was risky, and many workers died when caves collapsed, but the Garamantes kept going and eventually built a network of water channels that went for thousands of kilometers across their land. These channels brought water that gave life to cities and farms in an area about the size of modern-day France. The Garamantes used this water to water date palms, grow millet and wheat, and keep gardens where they grew vegetables and plants that were good for them. They raised cows, goats, and sheep, and they learned how to keep food fresh for a long time, which helped them get through the years when even their deep aquifers ran low. This agricultural surplus created a lot of wealth, which not only supported a large urban population, but also a complex society with specialized craftsmen, professional soldiers, merchants who traded with civilizations as far away as the Aid, Mediterranean and Sub-Saharan Africa, and a scholarly class that made their own writing system and kept detailed records of their history and achievements. Roman explorers who went to Garama said it was one of the most beautiful cities they had ever seen, on par with Alexandria or Antioch in terms of wealth and sophistication. But even the smartest technology has its limits, and the Garamantes built their civilization on a base that couldn't last. The fossil aquifers they tapped into had been full for thousands of years when the weather was wetter, but they were emptying much faster than nature could fill them back up. Modern geological surveys have shown that the Garamantes may have taken as much as 1 billion cubic meters of water from these ancient reservoirs. This water had been slowly building up for thousands of years before people even lived in the area. The Garamantes were stuck in an impossible situation as the climate got drier and the population grew. Wells that had been flowing freely for generations started to run dry. This made them dig deeper and build their tunnels farther into areas where the water table was lower and the quality was worse. As irrigation water became less available and more salty, crop yields went down. The beautiful gardens that had made their cities famous withered and died. People started to leave the outer settlements and move to the core cities where there was still water. This made the remaining aquifers run out even faster. The Garamantes had fewer extra goods to trade, which made it harder for them to do business with their faraway partners. As resources ran low and competition for the few remaining water sources grew, the complicated social structure that had kept their civilization going started to fall apart. The end wasn't as dramatic as we might think from watching movies about ancient civilizations. There were no armies invading the desert, no volcanoes erupting, and no earthquakes that caused a lot of damage. The Garamantian civilization just disappeared as the desert took back their land, piece by piece, building by building, and generation by generation. The winds that blow across the Sahara all the time blew sand into the streets of abandoned neighbourhoods, where it started to pile up. The complicated irrigation channels, which were no longer cared for, got clogged with trash and eventually filled up with sand. The date palm groves died because they didn't have enough water. Only a few stumps were left, and they were quickly buried. The shifting sand weakened the foundations of the multi-storey buildings that had housed wealthy families, and the ruins were quickly covered by new deposits. One of Africa's most advanced ancient civilizations disappeared completely in a matter of centuries. Most historians didn't even know it had existed until recent archaeological finds. The desert had taken not only their buildings and roads, but also their memories, making them seem as if they had never existed at all in the historical record. The contrast between abundance and scarcity that we're talking about tonight is different in different parts of the world, but the lessons are the same everywhere. The relationship between human ambition and environmental limits, the importance of living within the means that nature gives us, and how fragile even our greatest achievements are. The story of the Garamantes shows one of the main ways that deserts take over kingdoms, by slowly running out of water sources that have supported human settlements for hundreds or thousands of years. There are also other things going on that are more sudden and dramatic, like changes in river courses, shifts in regional climate patterns, or disasters that can make a place unlivable in a generation or two. Take, for example, the haunting mystery of the lost cities along the Silk Road in Central Asia, a network of trade routes that connected the civilizations of East and West for over 1,000 years. The Taklamakan Desert, which means go in and you won't come out in local legend, now covers most of the Tarim Basin. In the past, there were many prosperous oasis cities in the basin that were important stops for merchants traveling between the silk markets of China and the spice bazaars of the Mediterranean. Lulan, Nia, Khotan, and Gaochang were cosmopolitan centers where Chinese silk merchants in flowing robes haggled with Persian traders in colorful turbans. Buddhist monks in saffron robes copied sacred texts onto palm leaves and parchment. Craftsmen made beautiful textiles that combined artistic traditions from all over the world, and scholars translated works of philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy between Chinese, Persian, Sanskrit, and Arabic. These cities were amazing examples of engineering and city planning, built to make life easier and more comfortable in the harsh desert. People built houses around central courtyards that were cool places to be during the day. Wind towers and underground channels were used in public buildings to cool the air naturally. The markets had beautiful vaulted roofs that kept goods and customers out of the harsh sun. Gardens and fountains not only watered plants, but they also looked nice, making green oases of peace and quiet in the middle of the huge desert. But all of these accomplishments relied entirely on rivers flowing down from the nearby mountains to form and keep their oasis environments. The Tarim River and its tributaries, the Yarkand, Khotan, Aksu, and Wagan rivers, brought snowmelt and glacier runoff from the Kunlun, Karakoram, and Tian Shan mountain ranges, creating ribbons of green fertility that snaked across an otherwise barren landscape. For centuries, this system worked beautifully, supporting not just the cities themselves, but also extensive agricultural areas where farmers grew wheat, barley, millet, and rice, tended vineyards and fruit orchards, and raised livestock that provided meat, milk, and wool for trade. The cities grew wealthy and sophisticated, developing their own languages, writing systems, art forms, and cultural traditions that blended influences from all the great civilizations of Eurasia. But rivers in arid regions are notoriously unstable, subject to forces that operate on scales far beyond human control or prediction. They can change course suddenly due to earthquakes that alter the slope of riverbeds, climate fluctuations that change the patterns of snowfall, and glacial melting in distant mountains, or even human interference upstream, where one civilization's irrigation projects can affect water availability hundreds of miles downstream. When a river that has nourished a city for centuries suddenly shifts its channel by just a few kilometers, the results can be catastrophic and irreversible. Without their water source, these oasis cities faced impossible choices. They could attempt to dig new channels to reach the relocated river, but such projects required enormous resources and often failed due to the technical challenges involved. They could try to relocate their entire populations to follow the water, but this meant abandoning centuries of investment in buildings, infrastructure, and agricultural development. Or they could hope that the river would return to its original course, a hope that was almost never fulfilled. Archaeological evidence suggests that most of these cities chose to fight for their survival, attempting increasingly desperate measures to maintain their water supplies. They dug deeper wells, extended their irrigation systems, and rationed water with ever greater severity. But when rivers fail in desert regions, there are rarely viable alternatives. Unlike cities in more temperate regions that might rely on rainfall or multiple water sources, these oasis settlements were entirely dependent on their single river system. The desert wasted no time in reclaiming what humans had temporarily borrowed from its domain. Sand dunes, no longer held back by vegetation and human activity, began to advance like slow-motion tsunamis. The process could take decades or centuries, but it was inexorable. Buildings that had stood for generations were buried under meters of sand. Streets became valleys between dunes. Gardens and fields disappeared beneath the advancing desert, leaving only slight variations in sand colour to mark where human habitation had once flourished. The dry desert air proved to be an excellent preservative, keeping organic materials intact in ways that would be impossible in more humid climates. Archaeologists working in these buried cities have discovered wooden structures with intricate carved details still clearly visible after 1,000 years, silk textiles whose colours remain vivid, paper documents with readable text, leather goods that look as if they were made yesterday, and even food stores with recognisable grains and dried fruits. What's particularly haunting about these Silk Road ghost cities is the evidence of how suddenly many of them were abandoned. Archaeological excavations reveal personal belongings left behind as if their owners had simply stepped out for a moment. Children's toys scattered on floors, cooking pots still containing the remains of meals, tools abandoned in the middle of projects, and jewellery and coins hidden in walls and floors as if their owners planned to return for them. It's a pattern that suggests people believed their abandonment would be temporary, that the water would return, that solutions would be found, and that life would somehow resume in the places where their families had lived for generations. They couldn't have known that the desert had claimed their homes forever, that sand dunes were already beginning to form in their empty streets, that within a century or two, their entire civilization would be as thoroughly buried as if it had never existed. This pattern of sudden abandonment, followed by gradual burial, is repeated across many desert-edge civilizations around the world. The process creates a unique form of time capsule, different from the violent destruction that warfare typically brings to ancient cities, different from the gradual decay that affects abandoned settlements in more temperate climates. Desert burial is both catastrophic and preservative, destroying civilizations while simultaneously mummifying them for future discovery. Unlike cities that are destroyed by conquering armies, where buildings are deliberately demolished and valuable items are looted, desert-buried settlements often preserve complete cross-sections of daily life. Unlike cities abandoned due to economic decline, where people have time to take their most precious possessions with them, these sudden abandonments leave behind complete households, workshops, and public buildings with all their contents intact. The result is that these buried cities provide incredibly detailed pictures of how people lived, worked, and thought in civilizations that disappeared centuries or millennia ago. We can study not just the grand monuments and public buildings that usually survive in archaeological sites, but also the humble homes of ordinary people, the workshops of craftsmen, the storerooms of merchants, and even the garbage dumps that reveal what people ate, how they lived, and what they discarded. But not all desert kingdoms disappeared due to environmental factors completely beyond human control. Sometimes the very success of a civilization contributed to its eventual downfall, creating conditions that made it more vulnerable to environmental stress and ultimately hastened its surrender to the advancing sands. The ancient city of Petra, carved into the red sandstone cliffs of Jordan, provides a compelling example of how human activity can accelerate desert encroachment and ultimately contribute to a civilization's demise. The Nabateans, who built Petra around the 4th century BCE, were master traders who had discovered the secret of prosperity in one of the world's most challenging environments. The Nabateans controlled the incense routes that brought frankincense and myrrh from the kingdoms of southern Arabia to the markets of the Mediterranean world. These precious resins were worth more than their weight in gold, used in religious ceremonies throughout the ancient world, and prized for their supposed medicinal properties. By controlling the desert routes that connected the incense-producing regions with the major population centers of Egypt, Syria, and the Greek islands, the Nabateans accumulated enormous wealth. With this wealth, they transformed what had been a modest desert settlement into one of the most spectacular cities of the ancient world. Petra became a showcase of architectural innovation and artistic achievement, with elaborate temples, tombs, and public buildings carved directly into the multicolored sandstone cliffs that surrounded the city. The famous Treasury Building, with its intricate Hellenistic facade carved into the pink rock face, was just one of hundreds of monuments that demonstrated the Nabateans' sophisticated understanding of engineering, architecture, and decorative arts. But the Nabateans were more than just wealthy merchants with expensive tastes in architecture. They were also remarkable engineers who developed some of the most sophisticated water management systems in the ancient world. Living in an environment that received only a few inches of rainfall per year, they created ingenious systems for collecting, storing, and distributing every drop of precious water that fell on their territory. They carved elaborate networks of channels and cisterns into the rock faces surrounding Petra, designed to capture rainwater from flash floods and store it for use during the long dry periods that characterized their desert environment. They built settling tanks that allowed muddy floodwater to clear before being stored in clean cisterns. They created distribution systems that could deliver water throughout the city using nothing but gravity and careful hydraulic engineering. These water management systems were so sophisticated that they could sustain a population of perhaps 30,000 people in an environment where a few hundred nomads would represent the natural carrying capacity. The success of their engineering allowed Petra to grow far beyond what the local environment could naturally support, transforming it from a small desert oasis into a major urban centre that competed with the greatest cities of the ancient world. But success bred excess, and the Nabateans' very prosperity created conditions that would ultimately threaten their survival. As Petra grew wealthier and more populous, its environmental impact expanded far beyond the immediate vicinity of the city itself. The Nabateans began to exploit their environment more intensively, clearing forests on the surrounding hills for construction timber and fuel, grazing ever larger herds of goats and camels on the sparse desert vegetation, and mining the landscape for stone, metals, and other raw materials needed to support their growing city. This intensive exploitation gradually degraded the local ecosystem in ways that made the region more vulnerable to drought and environmental stress. Deforestation reduced the land's ability to capture and retain rainwater, leading to increased erosion and more severe flash flooding during storms. Overgrazing destroyed the root systems that held desert soils together, making the landscape more susceptible to wind erosion and sand accumulation. Mining and quarrying disrupted natural drainage patterns and created new sources of dust and debris. At the same time, the Nabateans' success was attracting the attention of larger and more powerful neighbours. The Roman Empire, always interested in controlling profitable trade routes, began to exert increasing pressure on Nabatean territory. Roman merchants found ways to bypass Petra by establishing more direct sea routes to India that could bring spices and luxury goods to Mediterranean markets without paying Nabatean middlemen. When the Romans eventually absorbed Nabatean territory into their empire in 106 CE, they systematically redirected trade away from the traditional desert routes that had made Petra wealthy. The new Roman province of Arabia Petraea was administered from Bostra, a city hundreds of miles to the north, and Roman policy encouraged the development of sea-based trade routes that bypassed the Nabatean desert cities entirely. Without the wealth from trade to maintain their complex urban infrastructure, the Nabateans found themselves unable to sustain their large population in the harsh desert environment they had helped degrade. The elaborate water management systems that had made Petra possible required constant maintenance. Cisterns had to be cleaned, channels had to be cleared of debris, and distribution pipes had to be repaired or replaced regularly. As the city's population and wealth declined, this essential maintenance became increasingly difficult to afford and organise. Cisterns that had stored clean water for centuries began to silt up. Channels carved into cliff faces crumbled due to erosion and neglect. The hydraulic systems that had seemed like permanent conquests over the desert environment proved to be fragile human constructions that could survive only with constant care and investment. The abandonment of Petra wasn't immediate, but it was inexorable. As the population dwindled and maintenance of the water systems declined, the desert began to reassert itself in ways both subtle and dramatic. Sand began to accumulate in neglected areas of the city, blown in by the constant winds that sweep across the Jordan Desert. Flash floods, no longer controlled by well-maintained drainage systems, carved new channels through the ruins, destroying roads and buildings that had stood for centuries. Over the following centuries, much of the city disappeared beneath accumulated sand and debris, hidden from the outside world until European explorers rediscovered it in the early 19th century. When these first modern visitors reached Petra, they found a landscape that seemed almost magical. Elaborate facades carved into cliff faces emerging from sand dunes, fragments of columns and statues scattered across the desert floor, and architectural details of breathtaking beauty rising from what appeared to be empty wilderness. The story of Petra reminds us that the relationship between human civilization and desert environments is always precarious, requiring not just initial adaptation, but sustained wisdom in managing limited resources and maintaining the delicate balance between human needs and environmental constraints. When that wisdom fails, or when external circumstances change the conditions under which a civilization has learned to thrive, even the most spectacular achievements can find themselves at the mercy of the advancing sands. As we pause to reflect on these lost kingdoms, it's worth considering how their experiences might relate to our contemporary world. Climate change is once again reshaping the boundaries between fertile and arid lands across our planet. The Sahara is expanding southward into the Sahel at a rate of perhaps 30 miles per year, threatening agricultural communities across a band of Africa that stretches from Senegal to Sudan. Parts of Australia are experiencing their worst droughts in recorded history. The southwestern United States faces long-term water shortages that are forcing cities and farms to compete for increasingly scarce resources. Mediterranean regions from Spain to Turkey are seeing increased temperatures and decreased rainfall that threaten traditional agriculture and urban water supplies. Are we perhaps creating the conditions for future archaeologists to puzzle over our own buried cities? Will the ruins of Phoenix or Las Vegas someday lie beneath advancing sand dunes, their casinos and shopping centres preserved in the dry desert air like the temples and markets of ancient Petra? The question isn't entirely fanciful. These modern desert cities depend on the same kind of intensive resource extraction and complex technological systems that supported their ancient predecessors, and they face similar challenges in balancing human ambitions with environmental limits. But let's continue our journey through these sand-covered mysteries, because there are even more intriguing stories waiting to be told. Some of the most fascinating lost desert kingdoms are those that existed at the very edges of recorded history, known to us only through fragmentary references in ancient texts, legendary accounts preserved in oral traditions, and the occasional, dramatic archaeological discovery that forces us to revise our understanding of what was possible in the ancient world. Consider the enigmatic kingdom of Kush, centered in what is now Sudan, which for over 1,000 years was one of Africa's most powerful and sophisticated civilizations. From around 1070 BCE to 350 CE, the Kushites controlled vast territories along the Nile River, built impressive pyramids that rivaled those of their Egyptian neighbors, developed their own writing system and artistic traditions, and even conquered Egypt itself during the 8th century BCE, ruling as pharaohs for nearly a century. The Kushite capital of Meroe was a cosmopolitan city that controlled some of the most important trade routes in the ancient world. Located at the confluence of the Blue and White Nile rivers, Meroe served as a gateway between the Mediterranean world and the interior of Africa, channeling gold, ivory, exotic animals, and enslaved people northward, while bringing manufactured goods, ideas, and technologies southward into the heart of the continent. The city was famous throughout the ancient world for its iron production, a technology that gave the Kushites significant military and economic advantages over their neighbors. Meroe has been called the Birmingham of ancient Africa because of its extensive iron-working facilities, which produced not just weapons and tools for local use, but also trade goods that were exported across a network stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The Kushite rulers, including a remarkable series of powerful queens whom the Greeks called Candaces, built elaborate palaces, temples, and public buildings that demonstrated their wealth and sophisticated understanding of architecture and engineering. They developed their own artistic styles that combined Egyptian, Hellenistic, and indigenous African elements, creating sculptures, paintings, and decorative arts that are among the finest examples of ancient African creativity. Roman historians described military expeditions against Meroe, writing accounts that reveal both their respect for Kushite military capabilities and their frustration at being unable to establish permanent control over the region. There are references to Kushite ambassadors in texts from as far away as India, suggesting that the kingdom maintained diplomatic and trade relations with India relationships across vast distances. Yet despite this historical prominence and the clear evidence of their achievements, the Kushite civilization gradually faded from recorded history in ways that remain mysterious to modern scholars. The last known Kushite inscriptions in their distinctive Meroitic script date to around 350 CE, after which the kingdom seems to have simply vanished from the historical record. When European explorers reached the region in the 19th century, they found impressive ruins scattered across the landscape. Pyramids, temples, and the remains of what had clearly been substantial cities, but no local memory of who had built them, or when. What happened to the Kingdom of Kush remains one of archaeology's great mysteries, but climate change almost certainly played a significant role in their civilization's decline and eventual disappearance. The region became increasingly arid during the later centuries of Kushite rule, as shifts in global climate patterns reduced the annual flooding of the Nile River and decreased rainfall across the Sahel region of Africa. The Kushites had built their civilization around the seasonal rhythms of the Nile flood, which brought fertile soil and irrigation water to their agricultural areas each year. As these floods became less reliable and less extensive, agricultural productivity declined, reducing the surplus that had supported their urban populations, professional armies, and elaborate court culture. But environmental stress was probably not the only factor in the Kushite collapse. There were also increasing political pressures from the expanding Aksumite kingdom to the southeast, centered in what is now Ethiopia, and from nomadic tribes pushing in from the western deserts as their own territories became less habitable due to increasing aridity. The combination of environmental stress and external pressure created conditions that the Kushite state, despite its long history and sophisticated institutions, could not survive. As Meroe was gradually abandoned, the desert began its slow but inexorable work of burial. Sand dunes advanced over agricultural fields that had been cultivated for over 1,000 years. The elaborate irrigation systems that had sustained the city fell into disrepair, and were gradually covered by accumulating sand and silt. Residential districts were abandoned neighbourhood by neighbourhood as people moved away in search of better opportunities or simply died without replacements. Within a few centuries, much of what had been one of Africa's greatest cities was hidden beneath the desert floor, preserved in the dry climate but invisible to casual observation. The process was so complete that early European explorers had difficulty believing that such sophisticated ruins could have been created by African civilizations, leading to racist theories that attributed them to ancient Egyptian colonists, or even lost European civilizations. Recent archaeological work, using both traditional excavation techniques and modern technologies like satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, has revealed just how extensive these buried Kushite settlements actually were. What had appeared to be isolated ruins scattered across the landscape are now known to be parts of vast urban complexes that once housed hundreds of thousands of people. Satellite images reveal the geometric patterns of buried streets, the rectangular outlines of building foundations, and the linear traces of ancient irrigation channels extending for dozens of miles across what is now empty desert. Ground-penetrating radar has identified buried structures that include royal palaces, religious complexes, residential districts, workshop areas, and elaborate cemeteries that demonstrate the social complexity and artistic sophistication of Kushite civilization. The preservation of these sites has been remarkable, thanks to the same dry desert conditions that have protected other buried civilizations we've discussed tonight. Excavations have uncovered wooden artifacts, leather goods, textiles, and even organic remains that provide detailed information about daily life in ancient Meroe. Archaeologists have found intact workshops with their tools still in place, storerooms with amphorae still containing traces of ancient foods and oils, and residential areas with furniture and personal belongings that offer intimate glimpses into how people lived over 1500 years ago. But perhaps most intriguingly, archaeologists have also found evidence that the Kushites themselves were aware of their civilization's vulnerability and made systematic attempts to preserve their cultural heritage as their kingdom declined. Royal burial sites from the final centuries of Kushite rule contain elaborate collections of artifacts, texts, and artworks that seem to represent deliberate efforts to create cultural time capsules that would preserve their achievements for future generations. These discoveries suggest that the collapse of the Kushite kingdom wasn't simply a matter of environmental determinism or inevitable decline, but rather a complex process in which intelligent, sophisticated people made conscious choices about how to respond to mounting challenges. Some apparently chose to migrate to other regions where conditions were more favourable. Others worked to preserve their cultural traditions in new forms that could survive, even if their political institutions collapsed. Still others invested their remaining resources in monumental projects designed to ensure that their civilization would be remembered even if it could not be sustained. The variety of these responses reminds us that environmental challenges don't produce automatic outcomes, but rather create contexts within which human choices and actions determine what actually happens. The same climate changes that destroyed some civilizations may have stimulated innovation and adaptation in others. The difference often lay not in the severity of the environmental stress they faced, but in their ability to respond creatively and effectively to changing conditions. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of desert-buried kingdoms: the role of chance and timing in both their destruction and their rediscovery. Unlike the systematic destruction that warfare typically brings to ancient cities, where buildings are deliberately demolished according to military strategies and political objectives, desert burial is random and partial, determined by wind, patterns, topography, and the vagaries of climate that no human authority can control or predict. One building might be completely buried, while its neighbour remains partially visible for centuries. A shift in prevailing wind patterns might expose ruins that have been hidden for millennia, only to bury them again within a few decades. Seasonal variations in rainfall and temperature can cause buried structures to expand and contract in ways that bring them closer to the surface or push them deeper underground. This randomness means that our knowledge of these lost civilizations is often fragmentary and tantalizing, like trying to reconstruct a vast library from random pages scattered by the wind. We might find a beautiful piece of jewelry that demonstrates sophisticated metallurgical techniques, but lack the context to understand who wore it or what it meant to their society. We might discover a fragment of text in an ancient language, but have only scattered pieces of the writing system needed to decode its meaning. The search for these lost kingdoms has itself become a fascinating story of human persistence, ingenuity, and the evolution of archaeological techniques over the past 2 centuries. Early explorers relied primarily on local legends, the accounts of ancient travelers, and the occasional surface ruin exposed by wind or weather to guide their searches. These pioneers of desert archaeology often worked under incredibly difficult conditions, traveling for months across trackless wastelands with limited supplies and primitive equipment, driven by nothing but curiosity and the hope of discovery. Some of the most famous archaeological discoveries have been made entirely by accident. Bedouins following their herds across familiar routes have stumbled upon buried walls exposed by recent sandstorms. Construction crews building modern roads, railways, or irrigation systems have uncovered ancient foundations that had been hidden for centuries. Even treasure hunters and tomb robbers, despite their often destructive methods, have occasionally led archaeologists to significant sites by revealing the existence of buried ruins or artifact concentrations. But the most systematic and productive approach to finding lost desert kingdoms has been developed by modern space archaeologists, who use satellite imagery and other remote sensing techniques to identify subtle variations in surface features that might indicate buried structures. From orbit, the geometric patterns of human construction often remain visible long after the structures themselves have been completely buried by sand. Buried buildings create slight variations in surface temperature, moisture retention, and vegetation growth that show up in satellite images taken with different types of sensors. Ancient roads and irrigation channels create linear features that remain detectable from space for centuries after they've disappeared at ground level. Even completely buried cities can sometimes be identified by the subtle rectangular patterns their street grids create in the surface topography. These space-age techniques have revolutionized our understanding of how extensive some of these lost civilizations actually were, revealing urban complexes and settlement networks that are far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The Garamantian civilization we discussed earlier, for example, was once thought to have been limited to a few scattered oasis settlements. Satellite archaeology has now revealed that they controlled an integrated territory roughly the size of modern France, with hundreds of settlements connected by roads and sophisticated irrigation systems. Similar discoveries are being made in desert regions around the world, from the Atacama Desert of Chile to the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, each revealing new chapters in the story of how human civilizations have adapted to, thrived in, and ultimately succumbed to some of Earth's most challenging environments. If you're finding these stories as fascinating as I am, I'd encourage you to subscribe to hear more of these historical mysteries. There's something deeply moving about these lost kingdoms that goes beyond mere archaeological curiosity. Perhaps it's the reminder that even our greatest achievements are temporary in the vast sweep of geological time. Perhaps it's the wonder that comes with each new discovery, the sense that we're peeling back layers of time to reveal forgotten chapters of human experience. Or perhaps it's the recognition that these ancient peoples faced challenges not so different from our own, and their successes and failures offer insights that remain relevant today. The technology that's allowing us to rediscover these lost kingdoms is also helping us understand the environmental and climatic factors that caused their disappearance in the first place. By analysing ancient climate data preserved in ice cores from polar regions, lake sediments from closed basins, tree rings from long-lived desert plants, and even the chemical composition of ancient pottery and building materials. Scientists can reconstruct the environmental conditions that these civilizations faced with remarkable precision. This research has revealed patterns of climate change that operated over centuries and millennia, far longer than human lifespans, but crucial for understanding the long-term sustainability of human settlements in marginal environments. We now know, for example, that the period from roughly 1000 to 1300 CE was characterized by unusually warm and wet conditions across much of the world, what climatologists call the medieval warm period. This era of climatic stability and favorable conditions supported population growth and cultural development in many regions, including areas that are now extremely arid. But this favorable period was followed by what historians call the Little Ice Age, lasting roughly from 1300 to 1850 CE, during which global temperatures dropped and precipitation patterns shifted dramatically. Many civilizations that had flourished during the medieval warm period found themselves struggling to survive in the harsher conditions of the Little Ice Age, and some disappeared entirely during this period of environmental stress. One of the most striking discoveries from this paleoclimatic research is how often periods of civilizational collapse coincide with periods of climate instability. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, which saw the simultaneous destruction or abandonment of numerous advanced civilizations around the Mediterranean, including the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Turkey, and several Canaanite city-states, coincided with a period of severe drought that lasted for several decades. The fall of the classic Maya civilization, around 900 CE, occurred during what paleoclimatologists call the terminal classic drought, one of the most severe dry periods in Central American history. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, around 2200 BCE, corresponds with evidence for a massive drought that affected the entire Middle East. The decline of the Harappan civilization in the Indus Valley, around 1900 BCE, coincides with evidence that the monsoon rains that had supported their agriculture shifted southward, leaving their cities without adequate water supplies. These correlations don't necessarily mean that climate change was the sole cause of these civilizational collapses. Human societies are complex systems that can fail for many reasons, but they do suggest that environmental stress often played a crucial role, creating conditions in which civilizations that might have survived political upheaval, economic disruption, or military conflict during favorable times became vulnerable to complete collapse when environmental conditions made it difficult to feed their populations or maintain their essential infrastructure. The desert kingdoms we've been exploring tonight faced additional challenges beyond those confronting civilizations in more temperate regions. A civilization based in a river valley with reliable annual flooding might survive several years of reduced rainfall by drawing on stored grain reserves, importing food from other regions, or temporarily expanding their irrigation systems. But a civilization dependent on fossil groundwater or seasonal river flooding in an arid region had fewer options when environmental conditions shifted. This vulnerability was often exacerbated by the very success of these desert civilizations. As they grew wealthy and powerful, they typically expanded their populations beyond what their local environments could sustainably support during difficult periods. They developed complex trade networks that brought food and other necessities from distant regions, making them vulnerable to political disruptions or climate problems in areas far from their own territory. They invested heavily in monumental architecture, elaborate court ceremonies, professional armies, and other symbols of power and prestige that diverted resources from the maintenance of essential infrastructure like irrigation systems, water storage, facilities, and food reserves. When environmental stress or external pressure disrupted these complex systems, the results were often catastrophic, with sophisticated civilizations collapsing far more rapidly than the simple farming communities that had preceded them. But not all encounters between civilization and desert ended in burial and abandonment. Some cultures developed more sustainable relationships with arid environments, creating societies that could persist through environmental fluctuations, political upheavals, and the rise and fall of neighbouring civilizations. The Berber peoples of North Africa, for example, developed nomadic and semi-nomadic lifestyles that allowed them to move with changing conditions rather than fighting against them. These adaptive strategies often involved maintaining smaller, more dispersed populations that could be supported by the natural productivity of arid environments during both good years and bad. Rather than concentrating people in large cities that required constant inputs of food, water, and other resources from distant areas, successful desert cultures often organized themselves in networks of smaller settlements that could be abandoned and re-established as conditions changed. Traditional desert peoples also developed sophisticated knowledge of their environments that was passed down through generations in oral traditions, songs, stories, and ceremonial practices. This knowledge included understanding of seasonal weather patterns, the location and reliability of water sources, the behavior of desert storms and flash floods, the migration patterns of animals, and the growth cycles of useful plants. Such knowledge created cultural memory banks that could guide survival strategies over periods far longer than individual lifespans. The contrast between these adaptive desert cultures and the buried kingdoms we've been exploring raises profound questions about sustainability, resilience, and the relationship between human ambition and environmental limits. The great desert cities that now lie buried beneath the sand were often marvels of engineering, architecture, and social organization, representing the pinnacle of human achievement in their time and place. Their elaborate palaces, temples, and public buildings demonstrated humanity's capacity for creativity, technical skill, and artistic vision. Their complex irrigation systems, water storage facilities, and agricultural techniques showed remarkable understanding of environmental management and engineering principles. Their trade networks, diplomatic relationships, and cultural achievements proved that human societies could create connections and shared understandings that transcended geographical barriers and cultural differences. Yet their very grandeur may have contained the seeds of their destruction, as they pushed the boundaries of what their environments could sustainably support using the technologies and knowledge available to them. The tension between human ambition and environmental limits is perhaps the central theme in the story of desert kingdoms, a tension that remains relevant as we face our own environmental challenges in the 21st century. Modern archaeology is revealing that many of these ancient civilizations were well aware of their environmental vulnerabilities and made systematic attempts to address them using the best knowledge and technology available to them. The Nabateans of Petra, for instance, continued to develop increasingly sophisticated water conservation techniques as their environment became more arid, creating systems that could capture and store every possible drop of the scarce rainfall there. Region received. The Garamantes responded to declining water tables by digging their fogaras deeper and extending them farther into marginal areas, demonstrating remarkable persistence and ingenuity in their efforts to maintain their civilization. The various Silk Road cities developed elaborate protocols for water allocation during drought years, sophisticated techniques for food storage and preservation, and diplomatic arrangements with neighbouring settlements for mutual assistance during emergencies. But there seems to have been a limit to how far ancient technology and social organisation could extend the carrying capacity of desert environments. Even the most ingenious water management systems, the most efficient agricultural techniques, and the most carefully planned resource allocation could not indefinitely sustain large urban populations in environments where the fundamental balance between water supply and human demand was unsustainable. Modern technology, desalination plants that can turn seawater into fresh water, deep drilling equipment that can tap aquifers thousands of feet underground, global transportation networks that can bring food from any climate zone to any other, and air conditioning systems that make even the hottest climates habitable, allows contemporary desert cities like Las Vegas, Phoenix, Dubai, and Riyadh to support populations that would have been impossible in ancient times. Yet even these modern desert metropolises face questions about long-term sustainability as they compete for increasingly scarce water resources, depend on distant sources of food and energy, and grapple with the environmental costs of maintaining large populations in naturally inhospitable environments. The lessons from ancient desert kingdoms about the importance of living within environmental means, the dangers of over-exploiting natural resources, and the need for long-term thinking about sustainability remain relevant even in our age of advanced technology. As we move deeper into our exploration of these sand-covered mysteries, it's worth pausing to consider some of the most recent and surprising discoveries that are changing our understanding of how extensive and sophisticated these lost desert civilizations actually were. Archaeological techniques that have been developed just within the past decade or two are revealing buried settlements that dwarf anything historians had previously imagined. In the Sahara Desert, for example, satellite archaeology has identified what appears to be a vast network of settlements, roads, and irrigation systems covering an area larger than many modern countries. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry surveys have confirmed that many of these features represent substantial buried structures, not just scattered ruins or temporary camps, but permanent settlements that housed significant populations for extended periods. Recent excavations at some of these sites have uncovered evidence of sophisticated metallurgy, elaborate artistic traditions, complex social hierarchies, and trade relationships that extended across thousands of miles. Pottery analysis has revealed connections with civilizations as distant as the Indus Valley and ancient China. Isotope analysis of human remains shows that some residents of these remote desert settlements had traveled from regions thousands of miles away, suggesting either long-distance migration or extensive trade networks that brought people as well as goods across vast distances. Perhaps most surprisingly, some of these buried Saharan settlements appear to have been occupied for periods far longer than previously thought possible in such arid environments. Carbon dating of organic materials from different levels of excavation suggests continuous occupation for periods of many centuries, with some sites showing evidence of habitation spanning more than a millennium. This longevity implies levels of environmental adaptation and resource management that challenge our assumptions about what was possible using ancient technology. These weren't temporary settlements that flourished briefly during unusually wet periods, but permanent communities that found ways to survive and even thrive through multiple cycles of environmental change. The techniques they developed for water conservation, food production, and resource management in extremely arid conditions were apparently sophisticated enough to sustain substantial populations through both favourable and difficult periods. Some sites show evidence of elaborate underground storage systems for food and water, sophisticated techniques for desert agriculture, and even what appear to be early forms of climate control using underground air circulation systems. Similar discoveries are being made in other desert regions around the world. In the Atacama Desert of Chile, recent archaeological surveys have identified the remains of settlements that may be among the oldest permanent human communities in the Americas. In the Arabian Peninsula, satellite archaeology has revealed extensive networks of ancient roads, settlements, and agricultural systems that suggest far more intensive human occupation than was previously thought possible. In Central Asia, the application of new archaeological techniques to sites along the ancient Silk Road is revealing that many of the oasis cities we thought we understood were actually much larger and more complex than surface evidence had suggested. Geophysical surveys show that cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv had extensive suburban areas, elaborate industrial districts, and complex water management systems that extended for many miles beyond their visible ruins. These discoveries are forcing archaeologists to revise their estimates of both the size and the sophistication of ancient desert civilizations. What had appeared to be scattered settlements separated by empty wasteland are now understood to have been parts of integrated settlement networks covering vast territories. Cities that seemed isolated in their desert environments are now known to have been centers of extensive agricultural and industrial activities that supported much larger populations than their ruins alone would suggest. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond academic archaeology. They suggest that human societies have been adapting to and thriving in arid environments for much longer periods and in much more sophisticated ways than we had previously understood. I want to take you on a trip back in time now, millions upon millions of years into the distant past of Earth, not a few decades or even centuries. Imagine, if you will, leaving your house and entering a planet so drastically different from your own that it might as well be an alien world. The poles are devoid of white ice caps. There isn't an endless expanse of frozen tundra across what is now Antarctica. Rather, the land is covered with dense forests that are thick with moisture from the warm, humid air. Where the glaciers of today would grind and crack, palm trees sway in soft breezes. In what is now known as the Arctic Circle, crocodiles lounge on riverbanks. The world is pulsing with life in ways we can hardly comprehend, as the very air shimmers with heat and humidity. This was Earth around 56 million years ago, during what scientists refer to as the Eocene thermal maximum. However, the brief fever dream of our planet's climate system was not an anomaly. This greenhouse world prevailed for the majority of Earth's long history. In reality, the modern icy planet with its seasonal snow and polar ice sheets is the exception rather than the rule. Let me first illustrate how different this world actually was, how eerily familiar yet utterly alien it would seem to us now. Imagine yourself standing on a beach in what would become Wyoming 55 million years ago. Indeed, there were beaches in Wyoming back then, and they were tropical ones with water so clear you could see the sandy bottom 20 feet below. From the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, the western interior seaway was a huge, shallow sea that divided North America in two like a huge waterway. Even in the continental interior, the water is bathwater warm, with year-round temperatures that would make a posh resort spa feel like home. The sound of palm fronds rustling overhead in the ever-present warm breeze blends with the sounds of early birdsong and the splashing of primitive whales in the surf. Whales in Wyoming indeed. These ocean giants' ancestors were only starting their amazing journey from land to sea, and some of them still had legs. They hunted fish in these inland waters and relaxed on beaches in between dives. You may be able to see Hyracotherium, an early horse ancestor that was no larger than a house cat, moving delicately on 4 feet through the underbrush in the distance. It moves with the deliberate grace of an animal that has never experienced winter, the bite of frost, or the lack of food that comes with seasonal change, and its coat shines with moisture from the constant humidity. When the air hits your skin, it feels different. The carbon dioxide and moisture make it thick, almost soupy. It fills your lungs more thoroughly than the thin air of our contemporary world, and you can taste its richness. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased by almost 4 times since the start of the Industrial Revolution, enveloping the entire planet in a blanket of warmth akin to a sky greenhouse. Even in what we now refer to as Canada or Siberia, temperatures rarely fall below what we would consider a pleasant summer evening, so you don't need to bundle up at night. Cooling breezes filled with the aroma of tropical flowers and the distant sound of nocturnal animals that have no modern counterparts are brought about by the darkness. Strange insects flutter through the humid air, their wings catching more starlight than our modern, cleaner, thinner atmosphere can see. This world, known to scientists as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, or PETM, is arguably the most striking illustration of Earth's greenhouse state in the geological record. However, we must go back even further, to the beginning of Earth's climate system's protracted dance between icehouse and greenhouse conditions, in order to comprehend how we got there and how our planet could change so drastically. The story starts around 540 million years ago, at the beginning of the period of visible life known to geologists as the Phanerozoic Eon. This signifies the emergence of sophisticated life forms, as well as the start of our in-depth knowledge of Earth's climate history. The geological record becomes hazy before this point, akin to reading a book with most of the pages torn out. However, we can read the Earth's climate story more clearly from 540 million years ago onward. Earth was in what is sometimes referred to as a permanent greenhouse state for the first few 100 million years of this eon. No ice sheets, not even tiny mountain glaciers, existed anywhere on Earth. Large tracts of what is now considered dry land were submerged by sea levels hundreds of feet higher than they are now. Palm trees grew in Greenland, and crocodiles swam in Arctic seas because the temperatures were so warm that tropical conditions spread nearly to the poles. It wasn't because the sun was hotter back then. The sun was actually a little colder back then, burning through its nuclear fuel more slowly, according to stellar physics. The Earth's atmosphere, which had far more carbon dioxide than it does now, was the only source of the warmth. More intense and widespread volcanic activity was releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere on a constant basis, akin to an incessant planetary heating system. The warming was caused in part by the way the continents were arranged. Shallow tropical seas covered a large portion of what is now land, and the majority of Earth's landmass was grouped close to the equator. With ocean currents flowing freely from equator to pole, these warm, shallow seas were extraordinarily effective at absorbing solar energy and redistributing it throughout the world. The story becomes really interesting at this point, though, as we start to understand the complex network of feedbacks that control the climate of our planet. Something extraordinary occurred during the late Ordovician period, some 460 million years ago. Permanent ice sheets started to form for the first time in Earth's history. Much of what is now South America and North Africa was covered by continental-scale ice sheets, not just tiny mountain glaciers. It was not a slow transition. Geological evidence indicates that it occurred over a period of perhaps a few million years, which is relatively quick in geological terms. The climate system that had been stable for hundreds of millions of years was drastically changed when Earth abruptly entered its first ice age. It was as though a switch had been thrown, altering the planet's fundamental operating system. What caused this significant change? A perfect storm of biological and geological changes that came together at the ideal time in Earth's history holds the key to the solution. A landmass where ice could form and remain was provided by the supercontinent Gondwana, which had drifted over the South Pole. The planet was cooling like a natural air conditioner thanks to massive volcanic eruptions in what is now the eastern United States that released particles that reflected sunlight back to space in addition to carbon dioxide. Most significantly, though, life itself was altering the chemistry of the planet. Marine life, especially those that formed shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate extracted straight from seawater, flourished during the Ordovician period. In essence, carbon dioxide was being consumed by brachiopods, bryozoans, corals, and innumerable other organisms, which combined it with calcium from worn rocks to form their protective shells. Like living carbon storage devices, these animals were removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and oceans at a never-before-seen rate, and storing it in their shells. They removed that carbon from the climate system completely when they died, carrying it to the ocean floor. As enormous monuments to this prehistoric biological carbon capture system, their shells accumulated in enormous limestone deposits that are still visible today. The efficiency of this biological carbon pump caused a sharp decline in atmospheric CO2 levels in a matter of millions of years. Temperatures dropped, the greenhouse effect lessened, and snowfall from the winter started to persist into the summer for the first time in Earth's history. One of the defining characteristics of Earth's climate system was the feedback loop that resulted from the accumulation and persistence of ice, which further cooled the planet by reflecting more sunlight. The onset of the Ice Age was only the beginning of a story that would unfold over hundreds of millions of years. However, this initial Ice Age was short-lived. The ice sheets expanded and contracted over millions of years in reaction to minute variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun. The amount of solar energy that reaches different parts of Earth at different times of the year is influenced by these Milankovitch cycles, which were first described in the early 20th century by the Serbian astronomer Milutin Milankovic. The way the cycles operate is that Earth's orbit around the Sun is somewhat elliptical rather than perfectly round. This ellipse's shape varies over cycles of about 100,000 years. Every 26,000 years, the Earth's axis of rotation completes a full wobble resembling a spinning top. Additionally, over 41,000-year cycles, the tilt of the Earth's axis itself varies, sometimes intensifying the seasons and other times lessening them. Ice sheets grew, locking up more water and lowering sea levels when orbital cycles favoured cooler conditions. Sea levels rose when they preferred warmer conditions, causing the ice to retreat and occasionally vanish completely. Throughout millions of years, the Earth fluctuated between icehouse and greenhouse states, but the changes were much more drastic than anything we have seen in recorded human history. Think of the Earth as a huge pendulum that swings between extremes of heat and cold over eons so long that whole mountain ranges could rise and fall in a single swing. The ice ages were significant changes in the way the planet functioned, not just short-term disruptions of its warm climate. Earth had drastically returned to greenhouse conditions by the end of the Permian period, some 250 million years ago. Sea levels had risen to some of their highest levels ever, the ice sheets had melted completely, and the temperatures were warm from pole to pole once more. One of the most devastating occurrences in Earth's history, the Great Dying, accelerated this shift when massive volcanic eruptions in present-day Siberia released copious amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. These were not your typical volcanic eruptions. Over thousands of years, millions of cubic miles of lava erupted, creating what geologists refer to as the Siberian Traps. Imagine a region the size of Europe, covered in thousands of feet of thick lava flows, with eruptions occurring year after year, decade after decade, and century after century. A runaway greenhouse effect caused by the astounding amount of gas released caused global temperatures to rise to levels never before or since. In the tropics, ocean temperatures may have risen to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which is extremely hot and would kill the majority of marine life. Large volumes of CO2 were absorbed by the oceans, turning them acidic, breaking down marine organisms' shells, and causing an ecological collapse. From deep waters depleted of oxygen, poisonous hydrogen sulfide gas bubbled up, forming green and purple seas that were poisonous to most living things and smelled like rotten eggs. More than at any other point in the geological record, life on Earth was on the verge of extinction during this crisis. 70% of terrestrial species and more than 90% of marine species disappeared from the fossil record. As they waited for the planet to heal itself, the few survivors huddled in refugia, small areas of habitat where living conditions were still barely bearable. However, life is extremely resilient, and the climate system steadied over millions of years. Temperatures cooled, natural processes started clearing the atmosphere of excess carbon dioxide, and volcanic eruptions stopped. The result was a new greenhouse world, distinct from the previous one, but again marked by high sea levels, warm temperatures, and the lack of large ice sheets. When dinosaurs started to gain dominance during the Triassic period, some 230 million years ago, they inherited this world. Earth stayed in greenhouse mode during the whole 165 million year dinosaur era, which spanned from the late Triassic to the end of the Cretaceous period. There were fluctuations, undoubtedly warmer or colder times than others, but no ice ages. There are no polar ice caps, no glaciers, with the possible exception of the tallest mountains. The most recent and well-documented example of Earth's greenhouse state is the so-called Mesozoic era, and some of the clearest examples of how different a greenhouse world can be come from this time period. Our preconceptions about what Earth can sustain are called into question by the fossils from this era, which depict a planet so lush and richly alive. Around 100 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period, the entire planet was covered in lush vegetation. Today's polar bears hunt seals across frozen seas, while crocodiles lounge in Arctic waters. These were enormous predators, some over 30 feet long, that thrived in warm Arctic waters teeming with fish and marine reptiles. They were not tiny crocodiles fighting for their lives in marginal conditions. Dawn redwood forests flourished on Ellesmere Island, one of the planet's northernmost islands, according to fossil evidence. The enormous trunks of these forests reached 200 feet toward a sun that never set during the Arctic summer, but never went below the horizon during the gloomy winter months. In order to survive the polar night, the trees, like contemporary deciduous trees, went dormant. When the sun returned, the high CO2 levels and warm temperatures caused the trees to re-emerge. There was so much moisture in the air that areas that are now deserts were soaked by tropical rainstorms. Rather than being a huge desert, the Sahara was dotted with lakes, rivers, and lush vegetation. Fish, crocodile, and aquatic plant fossils have been discovered in some of the driest locations on the planet. Massive rivers once flowed where there is now only shifting sand, as evidenced by river channels preserved in the rock. The sheer volume of life this greenhouse world supported, however, was arguably its most remarkable aspect. Sea levels were 300 to 500 feet higher than they are now when ice sheets weren't blocking up so much water. Under shallow, warm seas that teemed with life like enormous aquatic gardens, much of what is now the interior of continents was submerged. Geologists refer to these seas as epicontinental, and they were unlike anything that exists today. Imagine the Great Plains covered by Mediterranean-sized seas that were as warm as bathwater, pristine, and so teeming with life that the water occasionally became murky with plankton. While giant sea turtles the size of small cars cruised near the surface, long-necked plesiosaurs, which hunted fish and squid, and other massive marine reptiles glided through these waters. Tonight, from where in the world are you listening? You may be shocked to hear that one of these ancient seas once covered your area if you're in the central United States. North America was split into two distinct land masses, Laramidia to the west and Appalachia to the east by the Western Interior Seaway, which ran from Canada to Mexico. 90 million years ago, if you were standing in Kansas, you would have been underwater, maybe 100 feet below the surface, watching marine reptiles and ammonites glide by in the tropical clear water above your head. Around you, schools of primitive fish would dart between the branches and shells like living silver, and the seafloor would be covered in coral gardens and oyster reefs. The actual continents were grouped closer to the equator back then than they are now. Together with the lack of ice sheets, this configuration produced an incredibly effective global heat distribution system. The sharp temperature differences that shape contemporary weather patterns were not produced by polar ice caps. Rather than cooling due to the heavy layer of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, warm equatorial waters could freely flow to high latitudes. Cretaceous ocean currents differed greatly from modern ones. The oceans used completely different processes to transport heat around the planet in the absence of polar ice caps, which produce the temperature gradients that power contemporary circulation patterns. Oceanographers refer to this circulation system as warm saline bottom water, because warm, salty water from the tropics sank in some areas rather than cold, dense water sinking at the poles and driving deep circulation. Deep ocean waters used to be warm and frequently oxygen-poor, rather than cold and oxygen-rich like they are now. The chemistry of the ocean and marine life was significantly impacted by this altered circulation pattern. Only specialized bacteria could survive in the deep ocean's oxygen-depleted zones because warm, deep waters carried less dissolved oxygen than cold ones. The compressed remains of innumerable marine organisms that settled to the seafloor in oxygen-poor water where they could not decompose normally, resulted in the deposition of thick layers of organic-rich sediments as a result of these anoxic conditions. These sediments would develop into some of the most significant oil and gas deposits in the world over millions of years. We still rely on the biological productivity of the Earth's greenhouse ages in a very real way. The compressed remains of plants and marine life that existed during these prehistoric eras of intense warmth and biological abundance make up a large portion of the fossil fuels that propelled the Industrial Revolution and still power our contemporary economy. The energy of ancient sunlight, which was captured by plants and plankton during Earth's greenhouse past, is contained in every gallon of gasoline, cubic foot of natural gas, and lump of coal. However, the world of greenhouses wasn't always safe. Life was impossible in some environments due to the same processes that made it extraordinarily abundant in others. Huge volumes of moisture were trapped in the thick atmosphere that kept the polar regions warm, resulting in rainfall patterns that are very different from what we see today. Month-long monsoons could cover large swaths of land with warm rainstorms that would be like a mild shower compared to today's tropical storms. The stark contrasts in sea and land temperatures were the primary cause of these super monsoons. Massive low-pressure systems were formed when the continental interiors heated to unusually high temperatures during the summer, drawing humid air from the warm oceans inland. As a result, rainfall in some areas was measured in feet per month rather than inches per year. On the other hand, severe heat waves that lasted for decades could be produced by the heightened greenhouse effect. Temperatures in some continental interiors frequently surpassed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, resulting in enormous deserts that were even more severe than those we see today. The only places where life survived in these areas were oases that were nourished by subterranean water or by the occasional river. Because of the different continental arrangements and the different dynamics of a warmer planet, volcanic activity was frequently more intense during greenhouse periods than it is today. During greenhouse ages, massive volcanic provinces, regions where millions of cubic miles of lava poured out over comparatively short geological timespans, were more prevalent. These eruptions have the potential to momentarily intensify greenhouse conditions. Massive amounts of CO2 were added to an already warm atmosphere by the Deccan Traps in India, which erupted around the same time as the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. The greenhouse ages were interspersed with similar volcanic eruptions, each of which altered the global climate and set off waves of evolution and extinction. As I indicated at the start of our journey, the most striking example took place during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. A significant amount of carbon was released into the atmosphere approximately 56 million years ago. Methane hydrates, frozen deposits of methane gas stored in ocean sediments and permafrost, are the main theory, though scientists are still debating the precise source. Methane hydrates, which are created when methane gas gets trapped in ice crystals under extreme pressure and low temperature, are found in enormous amounts beneath the seafloor and in Arctic permafrost today. Similar to ice-stored natural gas, they are only stable in extremely specific circumstances. The ice melts, and the methane is released if the temperature increases or the pressure decreases. Something caused these hydrate deposits to become severely destabilized during the PETM. The ocean floor may have been heated by volcanic activity, a slow warming trend that reached a tipping point, or even an asteroid impact, though there is insufficient evidence to support the latter theory. Whatever the reason, massive volumes of methane escaped from melting permafrost and bubbled up from the ocean floor. Methane traps heat about 25 times more efficiently than carbon dioxide, making it an even more powerful greenhouse gas. Due to the feedback loop it produced, global temperatures quickly rose to levels not seen since the end Permian mass extinction 200 million years ago. More methane hydrates destabilized as temperatures increased, releasing more methane, which in turn led to more warming and more hydrate destabilization. Despite being a brief period of geological time, roughly 200,000 years, the PETM had profound effects that were unimaginable. The already warm baseline conditions were exceeded by 9 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. When you consider that the climate today differed by only about 11 degrees Fahrenheit from the last ice age, this doesn't seem like much. In Alaska and northern Canada, palm trees flourished, their fronds rustling in the warm Arctic winds. Crocodiles never experienced the touch of ice while swimming in Arctic waters that remained consistently above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Thousands of miles from the equator, the Arctic Ocean supported tropical marine life like a giant warm bathtub. However, extreme heat was not the only aspect of the PETM. There was also a lot of precipitation during that time. Rainfall events that would dwarf contemporary hurricanes could result from the warmer atmosphere's ability to hold far more moisture. According to fossil evidence, some areas saw what can only be called permanent storms, with daily rainfall measured in feet as opposed to inches annually. Even more astounding is the fact that evolutionary innovation flourished in this harsh greenhouse environment. Many groups of modern mammals, such as early primates, horses and whales, first appeared during the PET. High atmospheric CO2 levels and warm, humid weather made it perfect for plants to grow, which served as the foundation for food webs that sustained previously unheard of diversity. Small animals with grasping hands and forward-facing eyes, early primates first appeared in the warm forests of North America and Europe. They were well suited to living in the dense canopies of PETM forests. These were recognizable primates, our own ancestors making their first tentative moves toward intelligence, though they weren't yet the well-known lemurs and monkeys we know today. Although they were very different from modern horses, the ancestors of modern horses also made an appearance during the PETM. Hyracotherium, also known as the dawn horse, had 3 toes on its back and 4 on its front feet, making it about the size of a small dog. It consumed the soft leaves and fruits that were plentiful in the greenhouse world while living in the warm forests of the northern hemisphere. More dramatically, the evolution of the first whales occurred during the PETM. Despite still being 4-legged land mammals, these early cetaceans were starting their amazing transition to ocean life. One of the first whales ever discovered, Pachycetus, resembled a wolf more than a whale, but it had already acquired the unique skull characteristics that would enable its offspring to grow into the modern-day ocean giants. The PETM's warm, shallow waters were ideal for these evolutionary tests. Temperatures were steady, food was plentiful, and the high sea levels produced enormous tracts of habitat that are no longer there. The planet appeared to have transformed into an enormous evolutionary laboratory where novel life forms were being tested in previously unheard of abundance. However, the PETM also reveals an important aspect of Earth's climate system that scientists are just now starting to understand. The planet didn't experience a runaway greenhouse effect like Venus did, despite the harsh conditions, the enormous release of greenhouse gases and the sharp increase in temperatures. Rather, natural feedback processes took over, progressively eliminating excess carbon from the atmosphere and lowering temperatures to more manageable levels. Although it took hundreds of thousands of years for these feedback mechanisms to fully restore equilibrium, they were remarkably effective despite being slow by human standards. Because they thrived in the high CO2 environment, plants and algae extracted carbon from the atmosphere at previously unheard of rates through photosynthesis. Because carbonic acid in rainwater reacted with minerals to form compounds that locked carbon away in solid form, the warm, humid weathering accelerated the weathering of rocks. As a result of their adaptation to the shifting environment, marine life added more carbon to their skeletons and shells, which they then transferred to the seafloor upon their demise. Massive plankton blooms that functioned as biological carbon pumps, removing CO2 from the atmosphere and burying it in ocean sediments, were sustained by the warm seas. The PTM's harsh conditions ended around 55.5 million years ago, and Earth returned to the mostly warm greenhouse conditions that defined the majority of the early Cenozoic era. The planet had proven its extraordinary capacity for self-regulation, absorbing massive disturbances and progressively regaining equilibrium. However, the bedtime made an impression. The rest of life's history would be shaped by the evolutionary breakthroughs that took place during this brief greenhouse extreme. Humans were descended from early primates. The earliest horses would develop into the magnificent animals that we are familiar with today. The largest animals to have ever lived on Earth were the early whales. One of the most intriguing aspects of Earth's climate history is the tale of how this ancient greenhouse world ultimately came to an end. It took time to go from greenhouse to icehouse conditions, and cooling wasn't an easy process either. Millions of years passed during this slow, intricate change, which was fueled by a complex interaction of astronomical, biological, and geological elements. Around 50 million years ago, during the Middle Eocene period, the first indications of change emerged. Although global temperatures had started a gradual, erratic decline from the extreme peaks of the PETM, they were still significantly warmer than they are today. There were still no Antarctic ice sheets, but for the first time in tens of millions of years, seasonal frost was starting to show up in some high latitude areas. This slow cooling was mostly caused by geological forces. The tectonic plates' unstoppable movement was causing the continents to gradually drift toward their current locations. The pieces of the long-defunct supercontinent Pangaea were gradually forming the current configuration. The global climate and ocean circulation were significantly impacted by this continental drift. Ocean currents' paths were altered by the movement of continents. As mountain ranges rose and fell, precipitation and wind patterns changed. The distribution of heat around the world was impacted by changes in the very shape of ocean basins. It resembled gradually reorganizing a planetary heating system's plumbing. Two significant geological occurrences, approximately 35 million years ago, prepared the way for the end of the greenhouse age. Initially, Antarctica became isolated at the South Pole as Australia drifted northward and split off from Antarctica. The circumpolar current, a huge ocean current that circles Antarctica and isolates it from warmer waters to the north, was made possible by this separation. Second, this thermal isolation was completed with the opening of the Drake Passage between Antarctica and South America. Cut off from the warm tropical currents that had kept Antarctica free of ice during the greenhouse age, the region was encircled by cold water for the first time in millions of years. Antarctica started to cool as warm tropical waters could no longer reach the continent. Winter snowfall in the Antarctic started to last into the summer. At first, there were only snow patches on the highest peaks, so this wasn't very dramatic, but it signaled the start of a significant shift in the Earth's climate system. This snow turned to ice over thousands of years, and Antarctica saw the formation of its first permanent ice sheets in almost 200 million years. As the cooling continued, the ice gradually expanded from its initial small size, restricted to high plateaus and mountain valleys. A significant change in the Earth's climate system was signaled by the formation of Antarctic ice sheets. Compared to rock or vegetation, ice reflects sunlight far more efficiently, returning solar energy to space rather than absorbing it. The cooling feedback produced by the expanding ice sheets sped up their own growth. The planet grew colder and more ice could form as a result of the increased reflection of sunlight. One of the most significant findings in climate science was this ice albedo feedback. It clarified how minor adjustments to the Earth's energy balance could have a significant impact on the climate. Global climate change and continental-scale ice sheets could eventually result from a small cooling that permitted ice to form in a few mountain valleys. Huge volumes of water were also trapped by the ice, which caused sea levels to drop globally and exposed large swaths of continental shelf that had been submerged during the greenhouse age. The new land's exposure altered ocean chemistry and weathering patterns, generating more feedback that strengthened the cooling trend. However, the changeover wasn't gradual or easy. Earth's climate system went through a number of dramatic oscillations as it transitioned from greenhouse to icehouse conditions, according to the geological record. In just a few thousand years, sea levels rose by hundreds of feet as temperatures briefly reversed back to near greenhouse levels, melting a large portion of the newly formed Antarctic ice. The intricacy of Earth's climate system and the numerous feedback loops that control its behaviour are reflected in these oscillations. The planet cooled even more as ice sheets expanded because they reflected more sunlight. However, their size also made them more brittle, making them susceptible to collapsing in the event of even a slight increase in temperature. The system was poised between several stable states. The last significant greenhouse episode occurred on Earth during the Middle Miocene, some 15 million years ago. Global temperatures increased to levels not seen since the Eocene during this Middle Miocene climate optimum. Sea levels increased by more than 100 feet, ice sheets drastically receded, and for a brief geological period, it appeared as though the greenhouse world might return. At least along its borders, Antarctica's forests have returned. Waters that had been frozen for millions of years were once again home to crocodiles. Temperatures in the Arctic increased to a point where temperate forests could thrive. It served as a reminder that the Ice Age was still young and might be reversible, and it was similar to a sneak peek at what Earth had been like during its greenhouse past. However, this turned out to be the final blow of the greenhouse era on Earth. The cooling trend had returned with even more vigour by 10 million years ago. Antarctica's permanent ice sheets were now irreversibly formed, and the ice ages that would dominate the planet's climate for the next few million years were set in motion. Around 3 million years ago, ice sheets started to form in the northern hemisphere for the first time since the Ordovician, marking the last transition to full icehouse conditions. Another significant geological shift that caused this was the rise of the Panamanian Isthmus, which connected North and South America and drastically changed the global ocean circulation. Warm tropical waters could freely move between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans prior to the isthmus's formation, dispersing heat globally and halting the formation of ice in the Arctic. This circulation was stopped when the land bridge was finished. The current circulation pattern was formed when the warm Gulf Stream was diverted northward into the North Atlantic, where it cooled and sank. It was similar to shutting off a valve in the Earth's circulation system when the Panama Isthmus formed. The Arctic Ocean was suddenly far more cut off from tropical heat sources. Winter saw the beginning of sea ice formation, which continued into the summer. The first ice sheets in the northern hemisphere since the Paleozoic were formed when this sea ice thickened and spread out onto land over thousands of years. Since then, Earth has been trapped in an ice age that is still going strong today. In reality, what we refer to as interglacial periods, such as the one we are currently experiencing, are merely short warm spells that occur in between much longer glacial periods. In stark contrast to the greenhouse conditions that dominated our planet's history, for the majority of its history, the Pleistocene ice ages of the last 2.6 million years represent Earth's current icehouse mode. The same Milankovitch cycles that had shaped the climate throughout Earth's history propelled the ice ages themselves, but they did so in a system that was favoured for the formation of ice. Massive ice sheet growth or retreat could now be caused by tiny changes in solar radiation that would have been negligible during the greenhouse era. Ice sheets stretched well south of their current boundaries during glacial times. Ice that was thousands of feet thick covered a large portion of northern North America. Parts of Asia and northern Europe were covered by similar ice sheets. Sea levels fell by more than 400 feet as a result of the enormous amount of water trapped in ice, exposing large swathes of continental shelf and forming land bridges between continents. The environment in which early humans evolved was produced by these glacial cycles. In order to adapt to the extreme climate fluctuations and environmental shifts that defined the Pleistocene, our species evolved during this ice age. The physical environment and the evolutionary forces that gave rise to human intelligence and culture were both influenced by the ice ages. It takes more than just academic geological detective work to comprehend Earth's greenhouse past. As human activities continue to change the chemical makeup of our atmosphere, these past climate episodes provide important insights into how our planet's climate system reacts to abrupt changes in atmospheric composition. They also offer a glimpse into potential futures. There are stark and depressing similarities between the greenhouse ages of the past and the present. Although not nearly as quickly as they are now due to human activity, atmospheric CO2 levels increased quickly during the PETM. The resulting warming was severe and persistent, affecting ecosystems globally for hundreds of thousands of years. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere today is higher than it has been in more than 3 million years, at over 420 parts per million. With the exception of the most intense volcanic eruptions, they're rising more quickly than at any other point in the geological record, at a rate of roughly 2.5 parts per million annually. This century may see CO2 levels not seen since the PETM if present trends continue. However, there are also significant distinctions between the current state of affairs and previous greenhouse episodes. Because the PETM took place over hundreds of thousands of years, life had plenty of time to adjust and move in response to shifting environmental conditions. New ecological relationships could emerge, species could evolve new adaptations, and ecosystems could change their ranges. The pace of climate change that is occurring today, over decades and centuries, may be too rapid for many species to adapt to. Furthermore, there were no ice sheets to melt and cause a catastrophic rise in sea levels because the world of the PETM was already significantly warmer than it is today. With ocean circulation patterns and continental arrangements that could support extreme warmth, the planet was ready for greenhouse conditions. If the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets melted entirely, the amount of water they currently contain would raise the world's sea levels by more than 200 feet. This scenario appears more likely as greenhouse gas concentrations rise. The natural world of previous greenhouse episodes is also very different from the human world. Our infrastructure, coastal cities, and agricultural systems are all tailored to the climate of today. Significant economic and social repercussions can result from even slight variations in temperature and precipitation patterns. It's possible that the stable circumstances that have supported human civilization for the past 10,000 years are coming to an end. The remarkable strength of feedback loops in the Earth's climate system is another thing that the greenhouse ages serve as a reminder of. Large reactions that last for millions of years can be triggered by small changes. The way Earth's climate system functions was significantly changed by the Ordovician ice sheet formation. During the Mesozoic, those ice sheets eventually melted, resulting in completely new planetary conditions that lasted for more than 150 million years. We might be seeing the start of another such fundamental shift today. An already unstable climate system is the backdrop for the sharp increase in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations brought on by human activity. Our current icehouse world is being defined by ice sheets that are rapidly retreating, and atmospheric CO2 levels are getting close to levels not seen since the Pliocene, more than 3 million years ago. Regardless of the steps we take to cut emissions in the ensuing decades, some scientists contend that we may already be headed toward a return to greenhouse conditions. Just as the changes that ended the greenhouse age 35 million years ago took millions of years to fully manifest, the climate system is accelerating, and changes initiated today could continue to unfold for centuries or millennia. The West Antarctic ice sheet is located mostly below sea level and seems to be essentially unstable in a warming world. It contains enough water to raise global sea levels by roughly 12 feet. The physics of ice sheet dynamics and ocean warming may cause retreat to continue once it starts in earnest, regardless of what happens to future emissions. With enough water in it to cause sea levels to rise by more than 20 feet, the Greenland ice sheet is already losing mass more quickly. Compared to thousands of years ago, summer melt seasons now last longer and extend higher up the ice sheet, similar to the ice albedo feedback that put an end to the greenhouse age millions of years ago. Dark areas of dust and algae on the ice surface absorb more sunlight, speeding up melting. However, there is also hope in the geological record, possibly not the kind of hope we might hope for. During the greenhouse ages, life not only survived, but flourished in spite of the harsh circumstances. Many of the animal groups that currently dominate ecosystems are the result of the evolutionary innovation that exploded during the PETM. Some of the biggest and most varied ecosystems in Earth's history were found in the Mesozoic greenhouse world. During greenhouse periods, tropical forests were more productive than any ecosystem in existence today. Warm temperatures, a lot of moisture, and high CO2 levels produced conditions that are nearly unthinkable for plants today. The fronds of the hundreds of miles of fern prairies would dwarf those of contemporary trees. Dinosaurs the size of school buses roamed among trunks as thick as redwoods in cathedral-like groves created by cycad forests. These prehistoric ecosystems were not merely bigger versions of contemporary ones. Rather, they were essentially distinct, with different rules and life forms. In the greenhouse, flowering plants, which had only recently evolved during the early Cretaceous, quickly diversified and co-evolved with insects in a riot of colour and complexity that produced the fundamental blueprint for contemporary ecosystems. The seas produced just as much. Food webs that could support marine reptiles larger than contemporary blue whales were supported by massive plankton blooms. Ammonites, which are related to modern octopi and squid, have developed incredibly complex and beautiful shells. Their spiral chambers are precisely designed to regulate buoyancy in the warm, crowded seas of the greenhouse world. This does not imply that human civilization would be unaffected by a return to greenhouse conditions. Our contemporary way of life is supported by infrastructure, coastal cities, and agricultural systems that have all been adjusted to the current climate. Current patterns of precipitation and temperature have left the cornfields and wheat belts that feed billions of people where they are. Coastal regions that are home to hundreds of millions of people would be submerged by rising sea levels. However, it does imply that, given enough time, life on Earth could adapt to drastically different climatic conditions. Humanity's task is to navigate the shift in a way that reduces suffering and protects as much of the natural environment as possible. Perspective on the actual scope of climate variability is also provided by knowledge of Earth's greenhouse past. The extreme heat of the PETM, or the end Permian greenhouse, is nothing compared to the warm periods we fear today. Even though Earth's climate has changed significantly more than what is anticipated to happen in the ensuing centuries, life has continued and eventually flourished. Life managed to adapt and survive during the most severe greenhouse episodes, when global temperatures were 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit higher than they are now. Plants that have adapted to the desert have developed defenses against intense heat and drought. Marine life evolved adaptations to survive in waters with low oxygen content and acidity. In order to stay active, even during the hottest times, mammals developed cooling systems. Like evolutionary recollections of prehistoric greenhouse worlds, some of these adaptations are still present in the genetic makeup of contemporary organisms. The instructions for surviving extreme heat and water stress are encoded in the DNA of desert plants, such as succulents and cacti. The warm, oxygen-poor conditions that once defined much of the ocean during greenhouse periods are still ideal for deep-sea organisms. This viewpoint reminds us that the Earth's climate system is capable of extraordinary variability, but it does not lessen the urgency of addressing the current climate change. In actuality, the stable conditions of the past 10,000 years, which have facilitated the growth and prosperity of human civilization, are exceptional in the long history of the planet. Our planet has been either significantly warmer or significantly colder than it is now for the majority of the last 500 million years. The Holocene's stable, temperate climate might be an anomaly rather than the norm. If so, one of humanity's biggest challenges in the coming centuries may be adapting to a more unpredictable and extreme climate. The close ties between climate and life are also demonstrated by the greenhouse ages. Not only did warm temperatures foster a profusion of life, but life itself actively influenced the climate. By removing CO2 from the atmosphere, the evolution of organisms that build shells contributed to the first ice age. During the Devonian period, the spread of land plants changed atmospheric chemistry and weathering patterns. The reflectivity of land surfaces and the effectiveness of soil carbon storage were altered by the Cenozoic evolution of grasses. Massive forests functioned as planetary air conditioners during greenhouse periods, generating their own weather patterns and transpiring vast volumes of water into the atmosphere. Today, on a smaller scale, the Amazon rainforest modifies regional climate and produces a large portion of its own rainfall. This was accomplished on a continental scale by ancient greenhouse forests, which produced extensive precipitation systems that could cover whole continents. Compared to today, coral reefs were bigger and more varied during greenhouse periods. Despite its impressive size, some of the reef systems that existed during the Cretaceous period dwarf the Great Barrier Reef. By storing massive amounts of carbon in limestone and serving as habitat for ecosystems that affected ocean chemistry globally. These ancient reefs did more than just react to the climate. They also contributed to its creation. Although humans are now the primary biological force influencing Earth's climate, the systems and feedback loops in which we operate have been in place for millions of years. These ancient systems will be affected by our decisions about energy use, land management, and ecosystem conservation in ways that we are only now starting to comprehend. Climate systems that were shaped during Earth's greenhouse past are influenced by the forests we preserve or destroy, the wetlands we preserve or drain, and the soils we cultivate or degrade. Navigating the upcoming climate changes may require an understanding of these profound connections. It's worthwhile to consider what the greenhouse ages teach us about the nature of planetary change. As our trip through deep time draws to a close, there were no slow straight-line changes from icehouse to greenhouse states. Abrupt changes, tipping points, where the system quickly changed from one stable state to another, were interspersed throughout. Once certain thresholds were crossed during the Ordovician, the first ice sheets formed rather quickly. Over a geological instant of only a few thousand years, the PETM experienced extreme warming. Before the system settled into its new stable state, there were a number of dramatic oscillations during the last transition from greenhouse to icehouse conditions at the end of the Eocene. These trends imply that the Earth's climate system has favoured modes of operation, such as greenhouse and icehouse states, which, once established, can last for millions of years. The system as a whole reorganises itself around new conditions during the relatively short but dramatic transitions between these states. These transitions frequently entail crossing critical thresholds, as the geological record demonstrates. Ice sheets first formed during the Ordovician, when atmospheric CO2 levels dropped below a specific threshold. During the PETM, ocean sediments released enormous amounts of methane when they rose above a certain level. These were quick transitions between states rather than gradual processes. According to this interpretation, we might be living through one of these transitional periods right now, when the icehouse conditions of the previous 35 million years give way to a return to greenhouse conditions that were more prevalent for the majority of Earth's history. It's possible that human activity's quick increase in atmospheric CO2 levels has already caused the climate system to surpass some crucial thresholds. We may have entered a zone of climate transition based on the melting of Arctic sea ice, the retreat of mountain glaciers, and the increasingly erratic behaviour of major ice sheets. Even if human emissions were to completely cease, These processes might become self-reinforcing once they acquire sufficient momentum. Although these changes may seem dramatic to humans, the geological record indicates that they are typical aspects of the Earth's climate system over extended periods of time. Our species' challenge is to learn how to move through such a shift with awareness and purpose, using our understanding of these systems functioning to inform our future decisions. No other life form has had the advantages we do. Changes in the climate are observable and quantifiable. We are able to project future changes and model the behavior of the climate system. We have the option to lower our emissions and modify our societies to accommodate the changing environment. The geological record contains lessons that we can use to address today's problems. However, we also confront previously unheard of difficulties. Life may not be able to adjust to the current rate of climate change. Human activity has a huge impact on the planet, influencing all ecosystems and climate processes. We are more susceptible to disruptions than previous life forms because of the complexity of modern civilization. The tale of Earth's lost greenhouse age is ultimately one of the resilience of life in the face of drastic environmental change. The power of small changes to produce big effects, and the intricate relationships between the physical and biological processes that have shaped our planet over hundreds of millions of years. Maybe you can picture yourself standing in one of those old greenhouse worlds as you go to sleep tonight. The smell of strange flowers and the sounds of extinct animals fill the warm, humid air that touches your skin. Hear the soft rippling of warm waters where deserts and mountains now loom. Observe the forests that extended uninterrupted from the equator to the poles as the sun sets. Imagine the great dinosaurs ambling through fern prairies, their footsteps reverberating through a landscape teeming with life. Imagine our own distant ancestors, the early mammals, scuttling through the underbrush of forests so productive and lush that they sustained ecosystems of unfathomable diversity. These are not science fiction or fantasy. The chemistry of old sediments, the forms of long extinct leaves, and the writings of rock and fossils are all reminders of our planet. Ancient seafloor fragments can be found on every mountain. The compressed remains of creatures that once roamed warm greenhouse seas are preserved in every piece of limestone. The carbon of old forests that grew under CO2-heavy skies is preserved in every lump of coal. Our planet is not as fragile as we sometimes think, as the greenhouse ages serve as a reminder. It is resilient, dynamic, and able to undergo remarkable transformation. The greenhouse worlds that dominated most of Earth's history were produced by the same processes that produced the ice ages that we are familiar with. As our planet reacts to the swift changes we're causing, the same forces that put an end to those greenhouse ages might be at work once more. However, the resilience of Earth functions over millions of years on geological timescales. Over many generations, the adaptations that made it possible for life to flourish in prehistoric greenhouse worlds were made. After severe greenhouse episodes, it took hundreds of thousands of years for the natural processes to stabilize the climate. One of the most climatically stable eras in Earth's history coincided with the development of human civilization. Compared to the sharp fluctuations that marked the majority of the geological past, there has been a strikingly small change in sea level and global temperature over the last 10,000 years. We were able to build cities, advance agriculture, and establish the intricate societies that characterize our contemporary world because of this stability. Maintaining civilization while the basic parameters of our environment change around us is a challenge, as we may move from our current icehouse world towards something more akin to Earth's greenhouse past. Although our species has never faced such a challenge, life on Earth has encountered it numerous times in various forms. There are cautions and hope in the geological record. It serves as a warning that climate systems are subject to abrupt and significant changes, sometimes lasting for millions of years. It demonstrates that although life is incredibly adaptive, this adaptability frequently results in mass extinction and a fundamental restructuring of ecosystems. By showing that even the most drastic climate changes are ultimately transient, it also gives hope. Eventually, the end Permian greenhouse that had been out of control stabilized. Eventually, the intense heat of the PETM subsided. Although the timescales involved may be much longer than those of human civilization, the planet has the capacity to self-regulate over the long term. Most significantly, the greenhouse ages serve as a reminder that we are a part of something much bigger than ourselves. Ancient forests and seas that flourished under greenhouse skies once contained the carbon that we are releasing by burning fossil fuels. Although we have significantly accelerated their pace, the natural cycles that underlie the climate changes we are causing have been going on for hundreds of millions of years. Although it gives us perspective on the scope and importance of the changes we're seeing, knowing our place in this big picture does not lessen our obligation to behave responsibly. Not only are we witnessing climate change, but we are also taking part in one of the most significant shifts in Earth's climate history, on par with the end of the greenhouse age 35 million years ago or the start of the ice ages 460 million years ago. We learn from the greenhouse ages that these shifts are periods of both opportunity and crisis. In addition to upending established systems and endangering long-standing lifestyles, they also foster innovation and adaptation, which have the potential to change the course of life on Earth. A world freed from dinosaur domination was left to the mammals who survived the end Cretaceous extinction. Human intelligence eventually evolved from the early primates that evolved during the PETM. Innumerable species evolved thanks to the new ecosystems that the grasses that proliferated during the cooling that followed the greenhouse ages produced. Given the current climate transition, what new opportunities might arise? What innovations and adaptations might result from the difficulties we confront? As our planet adapts to its changing environment, what new life and civilizational forms might emerge? Although there are no simple answers to these questions, they serve as a reminder that we are living in a critical juncture in Earth's history. For centuries or even millennia to come, the decisions we make in the upcoming decades will shape the course of climate change. We have the chance to actively participate in this significant shift and steer it in the direction of solutions that benefit both the natural world and human civilization. Rest well and dream of a world so different from our own that it could as well be a different planet, of old forests beneath warm polar skies, of seas that glittered where glaciers now grind. The memory of greenhouse ages past and possibly the seeds of greenhouse ages to come are still present in the rocks and ice of the same Earth that we call home. Written in the patient language of stone and sky, water and ice, the story goes on as it has for hundreds of millions of years. We are merely the most recent characters in this enormous story, endowed with the special capacity to read the narrative and possibly shape the events of the following chapters. Buried deep in the geological record, the greenhouse ages may be forgotten by most, but their lessons are still important today. They serve as a reminder that life is incredibly resilient, that our planet is capable of extraordinary change, and that the stable climate we have known is valuable because it is uncommon in Earth's lengthy history. As you sleep tonight, remember that you have seen something that very few people ever see: a look into the long history of Earth's climate and an awareness of the forces that have moulded our planet over hundreds of millions of years. Gaining insight into our planet's greenhouse past helps us make better decisions going forward and gives us perspective on the present.